Stone walls rise from river terraces and ridgelines set where water, labor, and rock come together. In these places, the Middle Ages leaves evidence that moves quietly beneath assumptions. Archaeology, materials science, and landscape study show that castles and cathedrals are not only monuments of power, but systems for daily life tuned to climate, soil, and the pace of seasons. The stone is never just stone, lime mortar binds crushed shell and burned limestone. Timber frames breathe with humidity cycles. Tile roofs and lead sheeting answer wind and rain. As the North Atlantic climate warms for several centuries and then cools again, the medieval climate anomaly, followed by the onset of the Little Ice Age, builders adapt in measurable ways, selecting woods of particular ring densities, shifting roof pitches and thickening walls where frost and storm increase. Across this long arc, a common myth recedes that medieval architecture is drab and colorless. Trace pigments on portal statues, choir screens, and interior ribs confirm that many churches, and some castles, carry vivid polychromy. Microscopic flakes of azurite, cinnabar, and verdigris persist in protected joints, making the old written claims of painted splendor credible. In dim chapels, ultramarine imported from lapis lazuli, mined far to the east, once saturated carved folds and starry vaults, and though the color now fades, chemical signatures remain. Here, a myth long treated as exaggeration proves true. Medieval spaces frequently blaze with color, and the visual field is closer to painted stone than bare ashlar. Beneath keeps and halls, latrines, cesspits, and drains map the habits of those who live within the walls. They show meals, ailments, and trade. Parasite eggs preserved in anaerobic pits point to cycles of hygiene and disease. Fish bones, often from herring and cod, rise in frequency after the 13th century, matching fasting calendars and expanding sea fisheries. Isotope ratios in human bones demonstrate shifts between terrestrial and marine protein, echoing rules of abstinence and the availability of preserved catch. Charred grains and weed seeds from hearth ash reveal mixed farming regimes and storage practices. The story is practical, not dramatic. Even in large castles, storage cellars, kitchens, and bakehouses dominate, and their waste tells a steady tale of bread, pottage, ale, and occasional meat. A lesser-known detail from many excavations recurs with its own quiet weight: the imprint of woven textiles, set into mortar and plaster, left by cloth used to smooth a fresh surface or cushion a mold. The weave persists where the fabric peels away, a negative of daily labor preserved in lime. It joins other small traces: a pin fallen beneath a choir stall, a whetstone forgotten in a wall gap, a mason's scratched geometry on a stair newel, making the spaces legible as workshops and homes, as much as fortifications or shrines. Within cathedrals, masons' marks stitched across blocks identify teams and pay units, while dendrochronology dates roof timbers to winters of felling. These rings tie construction phases to climate sequences and timber management. As glaciers across high latitudes adjust their margins and storm tracks, shift in response supply lines for stone and wood change. River levels fluctuate, altering the window when rafts and barges can pass under low bridges. Quarry faces step outward with each season's frost and thaw. The planetary scale presses gently on the local as North Atlantic oscillations rearrange rainfall. Masons schedule lime burning for dry spells, and kiln waste layers thicken where fuel is reliable. The castle courtyard and the cathedral close move with the sky. The spaces are loud in their own time, hammers on chisels, carts, bells, but the evidence we hold is quiet: a layer of plaster, a ceramic waster dump pollen grains in a gutter silt. Myths of constant filth and indifference to cleanliness yield to context. Bathhouses operate in many towns until changing moral regimes and fuel pressures alter their status in the late medieval and early modern periods. In some castles, warm rooms and heated benches appear where hippocausts or tile stoves succeed earlier braziers. Soap making shows up in residues and account rolls. Oily ash mixtures and animal fats stain workshop floors. Yet sanitation remains a challenge, and drains carry both water and waste toward streams below the walls. The material record holds both effort and limit without embellishment. Another familiar claim: spiral stairs built clockwise to disadvantage a right-handed attacker sits on more uncertain ground. Many towers do show clockwise spirals, yet numerous counterexamples exist, and practical constraints like doorway orientations, spatial reuse, and the available footprint complicate an easy rule. Here a mystery remains. Open design logic may blend defense circulation and inherited layouts in ways that defy a single explanation, and archaeologists caution against reading intent from one feature alone. Myths of secret tunnels threading every stronghold also fade under scrutiny. While postern passages and sallyports are documented, continuous escape galleries are rare, and their legends outgrow the few that exist. If painted stone proves truer than a gray, past the idea of universal hidden routes does not. Cathedrals, too, carry truths once questioned. Accounts from clergy and travelers describe interiors brilliant with gilding and imagery. For a long time, soot-blackened sculpture argued otherwise. Now multispectral imaging and pigment mapping restore those descriptions to credibility. In tympana and archivolts, tiny islands of original blue cluster where rain cannot scour. Gold leaf underdrawings cling behind canopies. Red lakes fix in microcracks. The discovery does not dramatize the builders. It simply aligns the physical record with the texts, settling one dispute and reframing another. How did communities source, afford, and maintain such color across centuries of weather and reform? Economic accounts list donations and contracts, but gaps remain, and the cadence of repainting cycles is still debated. Castle landscapes extend beyond walls. Pillow mounds for rabbits, fish ponds with controlled inflow and outflow, ridge and furrow fields pushing close to ditches. These features knit defense food and labor into a working estate. In dry years, pond beds are scraped. In wet years, banks are raised. As sea levels and storminess vary, coastal castles face maintenance costs. Written in salt iron, cramps corrode faster in spray, and limewash must be renewed. A scale reference is simple. To feed a great household through winter requires grain movements heavier than a convoy of carts, and the estate radius that supports a single keep may sprawl over distances that, on foot, stretch beyond a long day's march. In workshops, ironwork and timber meet. Door bands, hinges, and nails rust to smears, but their patterns are predictable. Carpenters set scribe lines and leave layout marks, and sometimes a truss carries a carpenter's tally that still reads in sequence, proving on-site assembly more than prefabrication. The rhythm of cutting, lifting, pegging, and bracing shows in tool traces that run with the grain. These details rarely enter legend, yet they are the core of what endures, and they anchor another corrected image far from haphazard. Much medieval building is standardized by rule of thumb, guild tradition, and local measurement systems that keep proportions steady across regions. The walls also store sound and ritual. Bell frames groan in towers where oak dries slowly across centuries. Floor levels rise as burials accumulate in chancels. Wax drips into joints and seals dust. If a myth survives here, it is the idea that spiritual and practical life are separate. Excavations show overlap ovens near cloisters, workshops within the precinct markets hard by the churchyard. Written prohibitions indicate proximity strong enough to require policing. The structural evidence closes the distance between prayer and provisioning without comment. A single consensus fact draws the threads together. Material studies across hundreds of sites confirm that medieval-built environments are active responses to climate economy and belief, not static settings for legend. A single, lesser-known detail places a fingertip on that fact: the print of a woven cloth in a hidden layer of plaster, human touch set into stone. One unresolved mystery encourages restraint: the meaning of a particular staircase turn, or the function of an odd wall chase, remains uncertain without broader context. One planetary scale observation sets the tempo as circulation patterns shift in the North Atlantic, and alpine glaciers wax and wane. The sourcing of timber, the durability of mortar, and the schedule of river transport change with them. Inside the thickness of these walls, the record is modest. It does not shout. It waits in pigments, tool marks, and silt. In that stillness, several myths fall away, and a few color-on-stone gardens within fortifications stand confirmed by the evidence that light and time fail to erase. Burial grounds stretch across the medieval landscape, edging towns, surrounding churches, and marking fields with quiet density. Within these layers of soil, the history of plague becomes more than a tale of fear. It is written in bone DNA and the soil's chemistry. Myths have long hovered over these episodes, casting the Black Death as sudden, mysterious, and universally fatal. The archaeological record adjusts this view, revealing nuance in timing, spread, and survival. Ancient DNA extracted from teeth in plague pits confirms the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. And in some sites, even its genetic variants can be traced. These findings verify written accounts that many once questioned, showing that the disease described in chronicles does align with the organism now known. Yet the story is not static. Genomic sequencing reveals branches of the bacterium that appear change and sometimes disappear. The lineage responsible for the mid-14th century pandemic leaves descendants across Eurasia, but the exact pathways remain debated. Did it spread repeatedly from a central reservoir, or did multiple introductions occur? The mystery rests unresolved, and excavation after excavation adds fragments rather than closure. In layers above and below plague burials, isotope analysis provides another correction to myth. Skeletal chemistry shows not only diet, but stress lines of enamel hypoplasia mark childhood hunger. Nitrogen ratios show reliance on peas beans and occasional fish. Contrary to tales of constant feasting among the privileged, famine and scarcity ripple through many skeletons. In plague centuries, these nutritional stresses are clear, pointing to populations already vulnerable when disease arrives. The myth of plague as a sudden invader into otherwise stable lives is softened. Instead, it emerges against a background of climatic cooling, harvest failures, and fragile health. The planetary scale presses again here as volcanic eruptions and solar cycles cool parts of the northern hemisphere tree rings, and ice cores show decades of shorter summers. Grain harvests falter and stored food shrinks. In these conditions, the bacterium finds foothold not only in human hosts, but in rodent populations whose dynamics depend on temperature and crop yields. The broader sky writes its pattern into village cemeteries. One lesser-known detail stands out from these excavations. Plague burials often cluster in trenches dug in haste. Yet in several towns, archaeologists find care even under duress. Bodies are arranged in rows, sometimes still aligned east-west, as in ordinary graves, sometimes wrapped in shrouds. In Hereford and London, small tokens such as rosary beads or simple buckles remain with the dead, evidence that ritual continues even under pressure. The myth of total breakdown yields to a picture of continuity, strained but not erased. Cities and villages improvise, but many retain structure in the act of burial. Another detail unfolds through parasites. Soil samples from intestinal regions of skeletons reveal eggs of whipworm and roundworm, proving infestations common before and during plague years. These parasites do not kill outright, but they weaken bodies, reduce nutrition, and make infections harder to resist. Their presence across Europe shows how the plague meets populations already contending with hidden burdens. Archaeology makes these quiet struggles visible, and in their visibility, myths of sudden devastation shift toward an image of cumulative vulnerability. Skeletal lesions tell more. Some show periostitis, signs of infection and inflammation long before the plague struck. Others reveal healed fractures, dental abscesses, or arthritis. These bones remind us that many people survive both ordinary hardship and extraordinary outbreak. The myth of total fatality is contradicted by simple demographic fact. Populations decline sharply but recover in time. Villages are abandoned, yet others persist. Their churches rebuilt, their fields resown. Survival is partial, but real. Genetic studies add a surprising layer. Some alleles linked to immune function appear to rise in frequency after plague waves, suggesting selection pressures at work. The interpretation is cautious, yet it indicates that humanity's genetic landscape shifts subtly in response to the bacterium. This is not myth nor folklore, but a record in DNA that confirms disease as a force shaping evolution. And yet the scale of change across centuries remains debated. How strong were these pressures, and how lasting? The evidence is present but incomplete. One unresolved mystery lies in reservoirs. Written accounts place the plague in cycles across Europe for centuries, but where between epidemics does the bacterium hide? Some argue for persistent rodent populations in Central Asia or the Caucasus. Others suggest local European reservoirs. The debate is open, and until more genetic sequences from ancient remains are mapped against ecological models, the answer waits. Myth once filled this gap with stories of poisoned wells or divine punishment. Now, science offers candidate explanations, but without final clarity. Planetary systems weigh heavily here. as the 14th century darkens under volcanic aerosols, as floods reshape river courses, as winters lengthen the movements of rats and fleas, altar and trade caravans redirect. The bacterium travels with these flows carried in bales of cloth, barrels of grain, or ships heavy with supplies. Coastlines extend or retreat with storms, ports shift, and with them routes of infection. The spread of plague across thousands of kilometers is not instantaneous, but tied to rhythms of trade winds, rivers, and human movement. This is a scale larger than any myth, but fully consistent with the evidence. At the ground level, trench excavations reveal another quiet truth. In Cambridge, skeletal studies show that plague victims are not only the poor. Priors and scholars from the university lie among common townspeople, their teeth bearing signs of rich diets with more meat and fish, yet they too fall. The myth that plague strikes only the destitute is overturned. Though vulnerability varies, no stratum is immune. Disease crosses walls and closes distance. In rural graveyards, the pattern differs. Some villages bury few, suggesting pockets spared or cycles missed. The bacterium moves unevenly, sometimes skipping regions, sometimes striking in waves years apart. Chronicles note these gaps, but archaeology grounds them in soil. The myth of uniform devastation is replaced by a map of uneven intensity. Another lesser-known detail: mass graves sometimes include animals. In certain digs, dog remains intermixed with human burials suggest that pets or guardians are lost together, a small but telling echo of the wider disruption of life. Even so, not all sites reveal plague pits. Many cemeteries show continuity, ordinary burials through plague years, implying either survival or relocation. The archaeological silence in some places is as meaningful as the trenches in others. Over centuries, subsequent building layers cover these cemeteries. Market squares and houses rise over forgotten pits. Only when redevelopment or chance excavation cuts through do they reappear, exposing myths to light and adjusting them with bone and sequence data. The myths themselves are not trivial. They once provided frameworks of meaning in times of suffering. But archaeology transforms them into something quieter, more complex. A consensus fact stands firm. Yersinia pestis DNA is recovered directly from 14th century burials, confirming the biological cause of the Black Death. A lesser-known detail adds texture: rosary beads or buckles in plague pits show ritual persists even in crisis. An unresolved scientific mystery remains: the precise long-term reservoirs of plague across Europe and Asia are not yet identified. A planetary-scale observation situates it all. Volcanic cooling, solar minima, and altered storm tracks make famine more likely, lowering resilience before disease arrives. Against this backdrop, the myth of incomprehensible terror is reshaped. The evidence reveals populations already strained, landscapes already shifting, and pathogens moving with the pulse of climate and trade. What remains is not a tale of panic alone, but of endurance within changing skies. Pilgrimage routes extend like threads across the medieval landscape, binding valleys, rivers, mountains, and coasts into networks that are both physical and symbolic. The myth of an isolated medieval world, villages shut off from wider contact towns enclosed within their walls, dissolves when viewed through the evidence of roads, shrines, relics, and way stations. Archaeology, written records, and even pollen cores reveal constant motion, showing how journeys for faith, trade, or obligation stretch across hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. The scallop shell emblem of Santiago de Compostela turns up far from Iberia, discovered in graves in Poland, Hungary, and even Scandinavia. This small object, portable and distinctive, is a fact carved into the archaeological record that proves not just legend, but long-distance contact. Each shell found inland testifies to one person's passage, or at least to the arrival of pilgrim souvenirs carried home. Another widely traveled object, a lead badge, appears in river dredgings and urban excavations, stamped with the likeness of Thomas Becket or other saints carried as protection. These artifacts break the myth of stillness, showing instead constant circulation. Roads that seem humble today, dirt tracks cutting between fields, once linked towns into systems of exchange. Written itineraries, such as those preserved by clerics or merchants, match with the distribution of roadside chapels and hospices uncovered by excavation. Some of these way stations lie in places where climate leaves a mark, at river crossings, where floods shift the route at mountain passes, where glaciers advance and retreat during the Little Ice Age at coastal margins where erosion and storm reshape paths. The planetary rhythms again shape human travel for safe passage, depends on stable weather, navigable rivers, and snow-free passes. At the scale of centuries, the shifting of these natural gates explains why certain pilgrimage routes flourish and others fall quiet. A lesser-known detail surfaces in the study of pollen along old trackways. Soil cores taken near medieval roads reveal spikes of trampled plants such as ribwort plantain and goosefoot species that thrive in disturbed ground. These micro-botanical traces align with written references to busy routes and confirm that travelers move consistently enough to alter local ecologies. Human motion thus inscribes itself into vegetation, a record as durable as stone. Pilgrimage is never only spiritual. Along routes to Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome, markets rise, villages adapt, and inns multiply. Excavations near shrines reveal imported pottery from France, glass beads from the Low Countries, and cloth seals from Flanders. These goods travel in the same wagons and saddlebags as relic tokens, blending devotion with commerce. The myth that medieval religion isolates itself from economy fades under this evidence. Instead, belief and trade operate together, sustaining roads and settlements alike. Maritime pilgrimages extend the pattern. Ports in the North Sea and Baltic send ships toward Norway's Shrine of St. Olav or southward toward Iberia. In harbor silt layers, anchors, coin hoards, and imported ceramics confirm these voyages. Written accounts describe storms and shipwrecks, but archaeology supplies the quieter continuity of trade goods that arrive even in distant towns. The sea, too, is a road, and its currents alter with climate. As the North Atlantic Oscillation shifts storm tracks, certain decades offer calmer passages while others bring risk. The rhythm of pilgrim fleets follows these long cycles, linking human devotion with atmospheric pressure patterns thousands of kilometers wide. One unresolved mystery persists: the scale of participation. Written accounts exaggerate numbers for effect, yet skeletal isotope analysis suggests a significant minority of individuals in medieval towns were not local. Strontium and oxygen isotope signatures show birthplaces far from burial sites, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. How many of these travelers are pilgrims, merchants, or migrants is debated. The myth of pilgrimage as rare and exceptional is challenged, but the exact proportion of a town's population shaped by mobility remains unknown. Roads also bind intellectual and artistic exchange. In scriptoria, copied manuscripts show marginalia, referencing distant shrines or places visited. The spread of liturgical forms confirms routes of influence. Decorative motifs in architecture, scallop shells carved in capitals, vines shaped in common patterns move with masons and artists who travel for commissions or join pilgrimage groups. These details push back against the myth of isolated regional styles, showing instead that mobility spreads both devotion and design. One striking example lies in a pilgrim burial excavated near Winchester, where isotopes suggest origins in North Africa. The presence of this individual in England buried with Christian rites shows that even in the medieval period, long-distance connections cross the Mediterranean. Such a detail, rarely known outside specialized studies, places medieval travel into a global context. Scale is essential. Some pilgrims walk routes equivalent to modern continental crossings days, stretching into months, distances exceeding 1,500 kilometers. To journey from Cologne to Santiago is a march longer than from Paris to Budapest, a distance across rivers, ridges, and shifting political boundaries. Written accounts describe hardship, but bones tell of endurance. Signs of repetitive strain on lower limbs and arthritic changes in knees confirm the physical toll of long journeys. Yet the paths endure, carved into soil marked by chapels and confirmed by artifact scatter. Myth once painted pilgrimage as purely spiritual or purely symbolic, yet the evidence insists it is material, bodily, ecological. Pilgrims bring plants to new places, their boots carrying seeds. They shift economies, sustaining inns and trades. They weave roads that remain visible even now. Another detail appears in diet. Excavations of roadside hospices reveal fish bones far from the sea preserved and carried inland, matching rules of fasting, but also revealing networks of distribution. The myth of monotony in medieval diet is overturned by the sheer range of species found along pilgrim roads: herring from the North Sea, dried cod from Iceland, almonds from the south, spices carried through Levantine trade. each item a quiet marker of distance collapsed by human motion. The planetary background threads through it all. As glaciers advance in alpine valleys during the 14th century, some passes become impassable for decades, and routes reroute through lower terrain. Written complaints of dangerous conditions match geological evidence of moraine advance. As sea levels fluctuate along estuaries, ports move shifting embarkation points. Pilgrimage, though, spiritual bends to these grand cycles. Even faith travels in rhythm with ice and tide. In each layer, myth recedes. Pilgrimage is not rare but common. The world is not closed but open. Medieval travel is not bounded, but continuous. A consensus fact anchors this strontium isotope analysis from many European skeletons, proves that significant portions of populations are not local to their burial grounds, confirming mobility. A lesser-known detail sharpens the picture. Pollen signatures along roads reveal ecological disturbance by centuries of footsteps. A mystery remains: the exact scale of pilgrims relative to merchants and migrants cannot be fully separated from isotopic data. A planetary observation sets the frame. Glaciers, oscillations, and coastlines govern which routes survive, proving that even faith moves within the cycles of Earth's climate. Pilgrims, peasants, traders, and clerics pass along the same roads, their footsteps leaving soil compaction, their tokens turning up centuries later in plow soil or riverbed. The myth of stillness falls silent before this evidence of motion, a world of medieval journeys mapped not by legend, but by the weight of shells, beads, and bones in the earth. In the quiet rooms of medieval scriptoria, myths about learning and knowledge take on unexpected forms. The common image of a static and ignorant age where manuscripts are copied without question and knowledge stagnates is not sustained by the material record. Instead, the study of parchment, ink, and marginalia reveals a world of adaptation, exchange, and subtle inquiry. The parchment itself tells stories. Isotope analysis of animal skins shows herds drawn from diverse regions, linking distant pastures to centers of learning. Ink recipes vary with access to minerals, oak galls, and trade networks. Spectral imaging reveals traces of iron gall ink mixed with carbon soot, pointing to experimentation. Within these materials lies a consensus fact: medieval manuscripts are products of widespread and interconnected economies, not of isolated monasteries alone. Yet within these texts, myths also grow of hidden codes, secret meanings, or flawless transmission. Archaeology and paleography adjust these myths, showing corrections, mistakes, and lively engagement by scribes and readers alike. Marginal notes often preserve the most vivid evidence. In the margins of a 12th century copy of Isidore's Etymologies, a student hand sketches a crude diagram of a plow, clarifying a passage about agriculture. In another manuscript, a scribe corrects a miscopied astronomical term by scraping away the ink and rewriting the palimpsest still visible under ultraviolet light. These corrections prove that medieval scholars are not passive transmitters, but active readers. The myth of blind copying falls away under the pressure of countless adjustments. A lesser-known detail emerges in the layered use of parchment. In some codices, earlier texts are scraped and overwritten, their ghosts lingering as palimpsests. Imaging technologies now recover these hidden layers, revealing lost works. Classical commentaries, early biblical translations, even medical treatises. These discoveries confirm that the scriptorium is not only a place of repetition, but of recycling and preservation, where the very scarcity of material ensures a dialogue across centuries. The planetary scale presses here too. As climate shifts alter herding patterns, the availability of parchment fluctuates. Drought reduces flocks, limiting skins for writing, while wetter decades encourage expansion. Trade in papyrus dwindles after the early medieval period, and paper technology only slowly enters Europe through Islamic intermediaries. Each shift in the wider environment is written in the supply of writing material, showing how knowledge production is bound to climate and trade. Manuscripts themselves move across borders. The myth of strictly local scholarship is contradicted by the spread of glosses and commentaries. A theological commentary originating in Paris is found copied in England within a generation. Arabic numerals appear in Latin manuscripts centuries before they dominate accounting. The flow of ideas is not closed. Isotopic analysis of parchment sometimes locates skins from distant regions, showing that books are imported objects carried along with merchants and pilgrims. Yet mysteries remain. One unresolved question is how widely texts are truly understood. Literacy is not universal, and the reach of these manuscripts into village life is uncertain. Archaeological evidence of book clasps, stylus tips, and writing tablets appears in towns, but whether their users are clerics, merchants, or literate artisans is still debated. The myth of uniform illiteracy is softened, but not replaced with certainty. In some places, graffiti scratched into church walls, names, ships, prayers suggest a broader engagement with writing than once assumed. These inscriptions, often overlooked, act as marginalia writ large upon stone, showing that people outside monasteries participate in textual culture. Another lesser-known detail emerges from chemical analysis of pigments used in manuscript illumination. Ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli, is found in manuscripts far from trade hubs, its presence indicating that even small scriptoria can access global networks, reaching to mines in Afghanistan. These tiny fragments of blue embedded in paint layers confirm the reach of medieval trade and the value placed on vivid imagery. The myth of dull monochrome manuscripts dissolves before pages alive with vermilion, gold leaf, and ultramarine. At planetary scale, these pigments speak of journeys across deserts, seas, and mountains, materials carried with caravans and ships that also bear spices, metals, and textiles. Another detail comes from wear patterns. Heavily thumbed margins reveal which passages are most often read, often psalms of comfort, or sections of medical texts. Manuscripts thus map medieval preoccupations, not by what is written, but by what is touched. These marks complicate myths of passive devotion, showing selective reading and active use. Errors preserved in manuscripts reinforce this view. Lists of stars contain misalignments that later readers correct. Medical recipes swap ingredients depending on local availability, blending authority with adaptation. The myth of frozen science gives way to a picture of pragmatic practice shaped by what herbs grow in a given climate or what minerals can be quarried nearby. Yet mysteries persist. The extent to which scribes understand all they copy is not always clear. Some texts in Arabic mathematics are reproduced without commentary, leaving it uncertain whether the scribe comprehends or merely transmits. Others, however, show glosses that suggest attempts at understanding, such as diagrams sketched in margins to solve geometric puzzles. The balance between comprehension and repetition remains unresolved. Scale appears again in the spread of manuscripts through universities. From Bologna to Oxford, standard textbooks circulate copied in large numbers. Binding fragments found in book covers often recycle older manuscripts, showing a continual reworking of material. Each fragment, sometimes only a line of liturgy or a gloss, proves the density of textual circulation. The myth that knowledge is hoarded collapses when confronted with the sheer volume of reused parchment found in bindings and accounts. Even within cloisters, manuscripts are not static. Light analysis shows fading from repeated reading near windows. Wax drips from candles leave marks on margins. Soot from lamps settles unevenly across pages. These environmental traces confirm centuries of use. One consensus fact anchors the whole picture. Scientific imaging has revealed erased texts beneath palimpsests, demonstrating that scriptoria preserve forgotten works while producing new ones. A lesser-known detail sharpens at lapis lazuli pigment, discovered in the dental calculus of a nun, suggests she illuminated manuscripts, proving that women as well as men participate in scholarly labor. A mystery remains unresolved how widely literacy and textual understanding extend beyond elite and clerical classes. A planetary-scale observation frames it. Shifts in climate and herd size alter the supply of parchment binding knowledge production to environmental cycles. In the stillness of medieval scriptoria, knowledge is neither frozen nor unchanging. It flows with the availability of materials, the circulation of goods, the curiosity of readers, and the accidents of preservation. Myths of ignorance, isolation, or blind repetition fall quiet before the evidence of scraped parchments, marginal sketches, and pigments that traveled halfway around the world. In this light, medieval learning appears less as a sealed chamber and more as a crossroads where voices of past and present meet on fragile leaves of parchment, their traces enduring in ink ash and dust. Across medieval fields and meadows, the rhythm of agriculture is bound to weather soil and season, and myths about unchanging peasant life begin to unravel when studied through the traces left in pollen-charred grain and plow marks. For centuries, the assumption lingered that medieval farming methods remained static, locked in a pattern of simple subsistence. Yet archaeology, environmental science, and written accounts reveal continual adjustment to shifting climate, soil exhaustion, and the broader forces of the Little Ice Age. A consensus fact stands firm. Pollen diagrams taken from peat bogs and lake sediments across Europe show clear shifts in cultivated species over time. Cereals such as rye expand where cooler conditions shorten growing seasons, while grape pollen retreats northward as vineyards wither under cooling skies. These records align with written complaints of failing harvests and wine shortages, confirming that climate change in the late Middle Ages reshapes the agricultural landscape in measurable ways. Yet within this broad pattern lies myth. The image of constant famine and misery is exaggerated. Archaeobotanical evidence shows diversity of crops with peas, beans, oats, and barley. Complementing bread grains and livestock bones reveal mixed diets that sustain resilience in many regions. It is not a uniform tale of decline, but a patchwork of adaptation. A lesser-known detail emerges in the study of ridge and furrow systems still visible in aerial photographs. These undulating fields carved by heavy plows drawn by oxen or horses serve not only to turn the soil, but to manage drainage during wetter decades. Their persistence in the landscape visible centuries after their use records a practical adjustment to the wetter climate phases of the Little Ice Age. Archaeological excavations of these ridges confirm layers of manure and domestic waste, deliberately spread to enrich soil, contradicting myths of primitive neglect. Farmers apply knowledge passed through generations, turning scarcity into technique. Another layer of adaptation shows in the spread of watermills and windmills. Written records and surviving foundations indicate tens of thousands across medieval Europe, far more than once assumed. These machines grind grain more efficiently, freeing labor and allowing surpluses to support growing populations before climatic downturns. Their distribution matches rivers, coasts, and plains, illustrating a landscape shaped by both natural forces and human ingenuity. Yet here too, a myth lingers that all communities have equal access. Excavations show that smaller villages often rely on hand querns long after mills spread the larger machines associated with monastic or seigneurial estates. The inequality of access is inscribed in broken quernstones reused in foundations and in rents paid for the right to use mills. One unresolved mystery remains the extent to which the Little Ice Age directly causes famines versus how much results from political and economic systems. Chronicles record years of hunger, yet archaeological layers show resilience in some places. Soil studies reveal fallow cycles and crop rotation extending sustainability. Was famine inevitable under climate stress, or was it intensified by taxation war and poor distribution? Scholars debate, and the evidence resists simple conclusion. The planetary scale presses close. Ice cores record volcanic eruptions that inject aerosols into the stratosphere, dimming sunlight and cooling summers. Tree rings across Europe narrow during these years, reflecting shortened growing seasons. In the wake of such events, pollen counts of cereal decline, weed species increase, and charred grains in storage pits indicate spoilage. The Earth's atmosphere shifting far above translates directly into empty granaries and silent fields. One vivid detail surfaces in the excavation of a medieval grange. Layers of grain stored in a timber-lined pit show not only wheat, but admixtures of rye and vetch, insurance against failure of a single crop. In some pits, evidence of germination suggests that damp storage ruins a harvest, perhaps the very disaster recorded in written laments. These small traces turn myth into material, showing how agricultural life balances on margins. Another lesser-known observation arises from isotopic studies of animal bones. As climate cools, cattle diets shift, showing increased reliance on hay and stored fodder, evidence of winter stabling becoming more common. This adaptation aligns with changes in building remains, more byres attached to houses, more manure spread onto ridges. The image of medieval peasants as passive is undermined by the ingenuity embedded in these patterns. Yet myths persist in chronicles. Writers describe rain falling for years, fields drowned, entire villages starving. Archaeology reveals exaggeration. While certain decades do show high mortality, many regions continue to produce surpluses. Grain trade expands, moving food from fertile basins to harder lands. Clay tablets, seals, and merchant accounts confirm grain moving along rivers, showing networks that buffer shortages. The myth of universal famine shrinks to the reality of regional crises within a wider economy. At planetary scale, these adaptations map onto continental shifts. As glaciers creep outward in alpine valleys grazing, land recedes, and herders move to lower slopes. Vineyards in England vanish, replaced by hardier grains. Icelandic settlements adjust their diet, relying more heavily on fish and marine mammals as pastures fail. These changes echo across Europe, each adaptation local, but connected through climate forcing. Another detail surfaces in the chemical analysis of mortar from granary walls. Salts leached from stored grain penetrate the stone, leaving traces centuries after the harvests. These residues confirm heavy use of certain storage spaces, tying written accounts of tithe barns to material evidence. Myth often casts barns as symbolic of seigneurial oppression. Archaeology shows their scale, but also their practical role in protecting communities from loss. Yet unresolved mysteries linger in the soil. Why do certain villages disappear during the 14th and 15th centuries? Some show signs of climate stress with fields waterlogged. Others show abrupt abandonment with little sign of famine. Were these moves driven by plague, by shifting trade, or by subtle changes in soil chemistry? The evidence is incomplete, and the myth of sudden desertion remains partly unanswered. A consensus fact stabilizes the picture. Pollen and tree ring records prove that Europe undergoes significant cooling during the Little Ice Age, and agriculture shifts accordingly. A lesser-known detail adds texture. Ridge and furrow plowing preserves evidence of deliberate adaptation to wetter conditions. A mystery persists. The true balance of climate versus human systems in causing famine remains unresolved. A planetary observation frames it all. Volcanic eruptions, solar variability, and shifting ocean currents dictate rainfall, temperature, and ultimately the yield of medieval harvests. Across fields and villages, the myth of medieval agriculture as stagnant collapses. Instead emerges a portrait of constant adjustment, resilience, and ingenuity within limits imposed by earth and sky. Farmers of the Middle Ages live in dialogue with climate-adapting methods and diets in ways both humble and far-reaching. Their traces in pollen pits and ridges endure, showing that beneath myths of misery lies a steady rhythm of survival, recalibrated with each change in the season and the sky. Beneath the enduring myth of a closed and insular medieval world lies evidence of trade routes stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, from the Baltic to the Sahara. Excavations, shipwrecks, and account rolls reveal not a landscape of isolation, but one of movement, exchange, and adaptation. A consensus fact is clear. Archaeological finds of goods such as Islamic glass in English towns, Baltic amber in Mediterranean ports, and Chinese porcelain in 14th century Norway confirm long-distance contact. These objects are not curiosities but regular markers of trade that challenge the notion of a parochial Middle Ages. The goods themselves are modest in volume compared to later centuries, yet their distribution is wide, threading together markets and cultures. Along the North Sea coasts, herring fisheries expand and dried fish becomes a commodity shipped in bulk to inland Europe. Excavations in Polish towns yield layers of herring bones and fish scales, remnants of meals far from the sea, confirming written accounts of the trade. In reverse, salt from the Great Pans of the Bay of Biscay or from Alpine Springs moves northward, enabling preservation and exchange. Myth once framed medieval diets as local and limited, yet these trades prove otherwise. Another detail is carried in cloth. Archaeological textiles and surviving seals from bales identify centers in Flanders and northern Italy as global producers. Woolen cloth from England is exported in vast quantities, its dye signatures detectable in microscopic fibers that still cling to iron seals recovered from rivers. These finds demonstrate not only production but branding and control, showing that trade networks extend deeply into rural life. The myth of local self-sufficiency weakens under the evidence of cloth and salt fish and grain. The planetary scale is not absent here. Climate influences trade as much as agriculture. During the medieval climate anomaly, calmer seas and warmer summers facilitate shipping in the North Atlantic, allowing Norse traders to reach Iceland and Greenland. Later, as the Little Ice Age brings harsher storms and sea ice, these routes constrict and colonies falter. Archaeological layers in Greenland's Norse settlements contain fewer imported goods in the 15th century, reflecting broader environmental stress. The rhythm of trade is written in the advance and retreat of ice. A lesser-known detail appears in glass beads. In West Africa, excavations of Gao and other towns reveal medieval glass imported from the Islamic world and Europe, while carnelian beads of African origin appear in European burials. These exchanges, modest yet undeniable, prove that Saharan routes join the global medieval economy. The myth that Europe turns inward after Rome collapses cannot survive against this network of evidence. In riverbeds of Central Europe, caches of broken amphorae and fragments of Syrian glass testify to imported goods that move along Danube and Rhine corridors. Written toll registers confirm the movement of wine, timber, iron, and cloth, their scale visible in account rolls, but grounded in the material culture scattered through excavation. Unresolved mysteries remain. The volume of trade is hard to measure. Archaeology shows presence but not proportion. One shard of porcelain proves contact but not frequency. Was Chinese porcelain in Bergen a rare luxury carried by a single ship or part of a broader flow? Scholars debate, and the answer is incomplete. Yet the myth of complete absence is replaced with an image of thin but steady threads stretching vast distances. Maritime archaeology expands the picture. Shipwrecks in the Baltic yield barrels of herring iron bars and English cloth frozen in time by cold waters. Mediterranean wrecks hold amphorae of oil and wine, grinding stones from the Levant, and glazed ceramics from North Africa. Each ship is a capsule of trade, proving continuity across seas. The planetary backdrop is visible in storm deposits that wreck some of these ships, aligning with climate records of tempestuous decades. Trade moves within the cycles of wind and weather, confirming that global forces govern local economies. One lesser-known detail arises from isotopic analysis of coin hoards. Silver content in European coins reveals origins in mines in Saxony, Bohemia, or the Harz, but also from Islamic dirhams melted and reminted. These chemical signatures prove that currency itself is a medium of long-distance contact. The myth of isolated economies collapses when coins in English soil carry the trace of silver dug in far-off mines. Another point comes from urban excavation. In London, fragments of Islamic pottery appear in layers of the 12th century, long before later expansions of trade. Their presence, though sparse, indicates early contacts often overlooked in grand narratives. Similarly, in Novgorod, birchbark letters record orders for imported goods, proving demand even in northern towns. These humble scraps of bark inscribed with everyday concerns testify to networks that myths of insularity fail to capture. At scale, trade routes reshape landscapes. Towns expand along rivers and coasts. Roads are improved for carts and storage facilities multiply. Grain warehouses in Lübeck, cloth halls in Bruges, and fish markets in London are architectural traces of trade embedded in stone and timber. Their size and durability prove economic integration far beyond subsistence. The planetary cycle returns droughts in one region, prompt grain shipments from another. Volcanic eruptions that dim the sun lead to poor harvests, driving prices up and spurring wider exchange. Trade is not separate from climate, but responsive to it, its pulses timed by global patterns. A consensus fact anchors the view. Chinese porcelain, Islamic glass, and African beads, recovered in European contexts, confirm long-distance medieval trade. A lesser-known detail sharpens it. Isotopic analysis of coinage shows silver from diverse mines, evidence of economic integration at the level of currency itself. A mystery remains unresolved. The scale of trade in proportion to local production is still debated, leaving uncertain how transformative these flows truly were. A planetary observation frames the whole. The medieval climate anomaly and the Little Ice Age dictate the rhythm of shipping, river navigability, and the survival or decline of trading outposts. The myth of an isolated Middle Ages dissolves into the quiet continuity of objects that traveled far from their origins. From fish bones in inland towns to beads and burials, from porcelain in northern latitudes to cloth seals in river mud, the material record reveals a world more open and interconnected than once believed. These networks are not yet the vast systems of later centuries, but they are durable, wide, and tied to the Earth's own rhythms of wind, ice, and storm. In the forge and the workshop, myths of medieval technology take their shape. The image of a world locked between superstition and crude tools has endured. Yet archaeology and material science reveal a more complex balance between practice and theory, between tangible iron and elusive alchemy. A consensus fact holds steady: the bloomery and later the blast furnace provide iron on a scale sufficient to arm armies, roof cathedrals, and shoe horses across a continent. Slag heaps beside rivers, magnetic surveys of buried furnaces, and excavated smithies prove that ironworking is widespread, skilled, and crucial. The myth of scarcity and primitive metal fades when confronted with thousands of tons of slag that remain in the soil. Within the forge, details are subtle. Tool marks on plowshares, knives, and nails show precision consistent with standardized forms. Microscopic study of hammer scales. Tiny flakes shed from hot metal during forging confirms the spread of specific techniques. These traces are invisible in chronicles, but undeniable in soil. Iron becomes the backbone of medieval life, from hinges to chainmail, contradicting myths that depict wooden worlds with rare metal. Yet alongside iron stands alchemy, long cast in legend as deception or folly. The evidence tells a different story. Excavations of urban workshops reveal crucibles stained with residues of copper, lead, and mercury, showing repeated experimentation. Written recipes preserved in manuscripts align with these finds, blending symbolic language with practical instructions. One lesser-known detail emerges in the discovery of distillation vessels and glass alembics in monastic contexts, suggesting that what later becomes chemistry is already present in medieval practice. The myth that alchemy is only metaphor or charlatanry is replaced by a quieter truth. It is a mixture of experiment, belief, and material craft. Unresolved mysteries remain. In some crucibles, traces of arsenic and antimony hint at attempts to alter alloys, but the precise purpose is debated. Were these efforts to change color to harden metals, or genuine attempts at transmutation? The line between practical metallurgy and pursuit of the philosopher's stone is blurred, and archaeology cannot always distinguish intent. The planetary scale presses in unexpected ways. Charcoal, the essential fuel of iron smelting, depends on forests. As populations expand in the 12th and 13th centuries, charcoal demand reshapes landscapes. Pollen studies show declines in certain tree species near smelting centers, with regrowth during later centuries as population and demand contract. The myth that medieval industry leaves little environmental mark is overturned by the measurable imprint of iron production on forests and soils. Another lesser-known detail lies in the slag itself. Some deposits contain phyolite crystals that only form under precise conditions of heat and oxygen, proving that smiths achieve consistent high temperatures long before thermometers exist. These mineral structures are silent witnesses to craft knowledge carried by practice rather than text. In urban contexts, smithies cluster near rivers for cooling water and transport. Excavations in London, York, and Paris reveal layers of cinder and broken tools, often overlain by later construction. The density of these finds shows how central smithing is to urban life. The myth that cities are purely centers of trade is complicated by their role as hubs of manufacture. At the household level, smaller repairs take place in kitchens and courtyards. Iron pins, awls, and knives are repaired until worn beyond use. Broken tools often become scrap, reforged into nails or rivets. The circulation of metal is nearly complete, minimizing waste. This frugality undermines myths of careless or clumsy technology. A scale reference sharpens perspective. A single cathedral roof requires tons of nails, each forged by hand. The labor represented in such buildings is measured not in myths of miracle, but in the rhythm of hammer blows repeated across decades. Alchemy moves within this same world. Manuscripts describe processes of distillation, sublimation, and calcination, often framed in symbolic terms. Archaeological finds confirm vessels scorched by repeated heating, suggesting that texts are enacted in practice. Traces of sulfur and mercury indicate attempts to manipulate color and luster, aligning with recipes for gilding or pigment preparation. Thus, alchemy participates in both material and intellectual economies, straddling science and symbol. The unresolved mystery here is interpretive: how much of alchemical writing is coded practical instruction, and how much allegory. Some vessels suggest applied experimentation, but without the words, the intent remains partly hidden. Planetary conditions influence even this pursuit. The cooling phases of the Little Ice Age increase demand for improved stoves, glazes, and fuels. Alchemists and artisans alike respond by refining techniques for heat and combustion. As forests thin, efficiency becomes more valuable, driving both practical innovation and speculative thought. Another surprising detail arises from cemeteries. Analysis of bone chemistry from smiths shows elevated iron levels suggesting occupational exposure. Some skeletons bear stress markers consistent with heavy hammer use, confirming that craft leaves imprints on the body. These are quiet testimonies to the physical demands behind every forged hinge or horseshoe. In myth, blacksmiths are figures of magic. In evidence, they are workers whose bones record labor. Yet myth retains a kernel of truth. The forge does seem magical to observers, transforming stone-like ore into shining blades. This duality helps explain why alchemy and metallurgy intertwine. The same fire that releases iron from rock might in imagination release gold from baser metals. In both cases, transformation is real, though not always in the form expected. Consensus facts hold firm. Iron production is widespread, technically advanced, and environmentally impactful across medieval Europe. Lesser-known details sharpen the picture. Phyllite crystals in slag-proof, controlled smelting conditions, and distillation vessels in monastic contexts show experimentation bridging craft and alchemy. Mysteries remain. The purpose of certain alloying attempts and the true intent behind symbolic alchemical recipes cannot yet be fully understood. A planetary observation frames the whole. Iron smelting consumes forests, altering regional ecologies, while climate shifts influence the need for more efficient fuels and processes. The myth of a stagnant or purely superstitious medieval metallurgy falls away, replaced by a landscape of practice, where iron anchors daily life and alchemy explores the possibilities of matter. Together they show that the Middle Ages is neither an age of ignorance nor of miraculous leaps, but of steady embodied work, with hands blackened by smoke and minds searching for hidden order in the transformations of fire. In chapels, shrines, and relic sites, the myths of medieval faith linger most strongly. Images of credulous masses, unquestioning devotion, and relics invented wholesale have long dominated. Yet archaeology, architecture, and science reveal a subtler picture where belief and materiality intertwine. A consensus fact anchors this: excavations across Europe uncover countless chapels, roadside crosses, and small shrines integrated into daily life, proving that devotion is not only grand, but local, woven into the landscape itself. Some are simple stone platforms with post holes for wooden crosses, others elaborate with frescoed walls and carved reliquaries. These findings align with written accounts of devotion spread across countryside and city, confirming faith as a spatial practice shaping movement and settlement. Yet myths of uniformity falter. A lesser-known detail arises in the discovery of pilgrim badges and amulets buried intentionally in foundations of houses and bridges. These artifacts, pressed into mortar or hidden under thresholds, show that relics and symbols are not confined to churches, but enter domestic and civic spaces. Faith is not abstract, but material, present in daily acts of protection and memory. The planetary scale appears in how these practices align with cycles of famine, plague, and climate. In times of crisis, relic cults intensify as people seek protection against forces they cannot control. Volcanic aerosols dim the sun, harvests fail, and processions bearing relics multiply, written in chronicles and confirmed by wax strips, coin offerings, and worn paving stones at shrine sites. Myth often portrays these acts as empty superstition, yet archaeology shows their practical role in binding communities, redistributing wealth, and maintaining social cohesion. Relics themselves move along trade routes. Fragments of saints' bones, cloths, or objects associated with holy figures appear in reliquaries far from their origins. Analysis of reliquaries sometimes reveals local substitutions, bones of animals mistaken or presented as human, but others are authentic by forensic measure, aligning with claimed dates. The myth that all relics are fraudulent collapses before the diversity of evidence. Some are clearly inauthentic, yet others trace verifiable connections. The unresolved mystery lies in how communities themselves perceived authenticity. Did they distinguish between symbolic presence and physical reality? Or was the line unimportant? Archaeology cannot yet answer, leaving the myth of blind credulity tempered by uncertainty. Architectural evidence deepens the picture. Chapels built along trade roads show repeated rebuilding after fire or flood, suggesting ongoing importance across centuries. Excavations reveal offerings of coins, pottery, and wax models deposited in these spaces. Some melted into floor cracks, others deliberately buried. The myth of medieval worship as purely solemn gives way to a picture of interactive practice where material offerings connect earthly concerns to divine hope. Lesser-known details sharpen this image. In some churchyards, lead ampullae, small flasks that once held holy water or oil, are found discarded or reused as amulets. Their distribution shows pilgrims carrying sacred substances home, embedding belief into ordinary lives. At planetary scale, the spread of relic cults mirrors climate stress and epidemic patterns. As the Little Ice Age deepens, shrines to plague saints proliferate, their chapels often located near city gates or roads. Archaeology confirms their role. Layers of coins, candles, and graffiti attest to their constant use. Myth frames such devotion as irrational. Evidence shows it as adaptive, providing structure in unstable times. Even within monasteries, faith and material practice overlap. Excavations of cloisters uncover workshops where pigments, medicines, and relic containers are crafted side by side. The myth that spiritual and material are separate collapses under these findings. In the same space, belief and craft reinforce one another. One unresolved scientific mystery lies in the circulation of relics. Many reliquaries contain materials sealed and never disturbed, yet isotope analysis shows origins spanning regions. How these items traveled, who authenticated them, and how communities accepted them remain partly unknown. The myth of uncritical acceptance is challenged, but not entirely dismissed, leaving open the question of how belief interacted with knowledge. Planetary rhythms press again. As glaciers advance and seas encroach on coasts, chapels are rebuilt, inland shrines shifted, cemeteries relocated. Belief adapts to landscape change, embedding spiritual continuity into shifting terrain. Faith is mobile, following rivers as they change course, mountains as passes open or close, and coasts as ports rise or decline. A lesser-known detail appears in acoustics. Studies of small chapels reveal architectural choices that amplify chanting or isolate sound. Excavations of floor tiles show wear patterns consistent with processions circling relics. These details prove that devotion is choreographed and embodied, not simply imagined. The myth of medieval worship as static ritual dissolves into evidence of dynamic physical practice. Consensus facts, minor details, mysteries, and planetary observations converge. Consensus shrines, chapels, and relics are ubiquitous across the medieval landscape, proven by excavation and architecture. Lesser-known detail, pilgrim badges and amulets appear in domestic foundations, embedding faith into everyday spaces. Mystery. The perception of relic authenticity remains unclear, whether symbolic or literal. Planetary observation, relic cults and shrines intensify during climate stress, famine, and epidemic, showing faith as a response to global forces. Faith and landscape remain inseparable. Towns grow around relic sites. Roads bend to meet shrines. Riverside chapels guide crossings. Myth portrays belief as detached from material life, yet evidence shows belief inscribed in stone, soil, and trade. Relics move as goods, chapels rise as landmarks, and faith endures as adaptation. Within this world, myths of blind credulity or universal fraud collapse. What endures instead is the complexity of devotion, where truth and legend blend into practices that sustain communities against the vast uncertainties of climate, disease, and time.